Thank you so much, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. I will share with you what is happening today in Washington related to higher education, reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, some of the proposals that are being brought forward, both on the House and the Senate side, and give you a sense of the timeline as how things might move forward over the next couple of years. There has been a bill introduced in the House. It's called the PROSPER Act. It's 542 pages long. I will not tell you about all the intricacies that are covered in that bill, but I'll try and hit on some of the highlights of things that I think you care about and are interested in. On the Senate side, they have not yet introduced a bill, but there are white papers out there. There have been hearings. There are frameworks out there from both the Republicans and the Democrats. So I will share with you directionally what they're thinking, where they're going, and what we might see in a bill when it is introduced. And then talk a little bit, sort of summarize where we see commonalities between what the House is proposing, what the Senate may propose, and what you're likely to see going forward. So you have a sense of that piece of it and what the next steps are. So as Caroline mentioned, we are a national trade association. We represent nonprofit state-based entities within their states that work to improve access and affordability of higher ed. So in Connecticut, that's CHESLA. In Rhode Island, that's RISLA. In Massachusetts, that's MEFA. Some of those names I hope sound familiar to you. Vermont, that's VSAC. These are all nonprofits that work to help families in their state figure out how to go to college, pay for college. And many of them also work on the back end to help families figure out, or students and borrowers to figure out how to repay their student loan debt. So they cover that whole aspect from beginning to end. The mission of our organization is really to help our members achieve these goals in terms of expanding access to higher education, facilitating student success, helping them figure out the best sources of funding to pay for college, make sure they're making smart borrowing decisions, and then, as I mentioned on the back end, helping them to make sure that they are successful in managing and paying down their student loan debt. So that's what our members do, and we do that in Washington through a number of ways, but the primary way is advocacy. So EFC is an organization that works and interacts quite a bit on the Hill with Congress, members of the staff of Congress, primarily education committees, with the administration, the Department of Education, Treasury, CFPB, all of those organizations. We are their voice in Washington in helping them to move forward policies that will help them to do what they need to do back in their home state. So that's from where I come from and the perspective from which I'm going to be sharing my comments today. So starting off with the current status of higher education, I'll start on the House side, as I mentioned, and let me just share with you the players. Chairwoman Fox from North Carolina is a Republican. She chairs that committee. And the ranking member is Bobby Scott from Virginia. He's a Democrat. Because the House is a Republican-controlled entity right now, the Republicans are really driving, if you will, what the policy is. And to that point, the PROSPER Act was introduced on December 1st. And in 12 days, it moved through committee. A 542-page document moved from introduction through committee and got passed. That is record speed. Think about how long, I mean, we in our office were trying to figure out how do we analyze all that's in 542 pages in basically 11 days. She was on Chairwoman Fox had a goal, and that is to get her bill through and to get it passed. In fact, she's still advocating and pushing to get it to the floor of the House before this Congress ends to get it completely passed, in the hopes that maybe a Senate bill will move and they will get HEA reauthorization passed. As I'll talk about in a little bit, that is highly unlikely, but it is moving her forward very quickly because there is an opportunity or a chance with the midterm elections that are coming up later this year that the House could switch, and it could be Democratic-led. So her reason for pushing it through is because this is truly, while they try to make most of these bills bipartisan, this has a true Republican bias to it, if you will. And so they're worried that they will lose a lot of those things if the Congress changes and it's led by Democrats. So just keep that in the back of your mind. As I mentioned, the next step is to go to the floor of the House. With Speaker Ryan's announcement that he will not seek re-election, the chance of that happening is slim to none because he is now in a different mode than he would have been had he been running for re-election. So the thing you have to pay attention to in Washington is just not the policies and the importance of good policy moving forward, but the politics. And who's positioning, who's running for office, who might end up in control of what, of the House or the Senate. All of this plays into how things move forward. On the Senate side, it's the HELP Committee, Health, Education, Labor, and Pension, that oversees HEA reauthorization. On that side, we have Chairman Alexander out of Tennessee. I really love Chairman Alexander as chair of this committee because he used to be Secretary of Education. He was a college president. He knows this space really well. So pleased to see him there. Ranking member Patty Murray is from Washington State. Also very thoughtful. I've met with her a couple times. Very thoughtful woman. Her focus, one of her biggest focuses is on campus safety. That's really important to her. The other thing that's really important to her is making sure there is access and affordability, especially for foster youth, homeless youth, folks from low income or disadvantaged backgrounds. That's a huge focus for her as she moves through reauthorization. This has been on Alexander's list ever since he came back into the Senate. He has been putting forward positions on how he wants to move forward with reauthorization well before we were even talking about reauthorization, including the FAST Act, which was introduced before and then reintroduced in January of 2015. That's the Financial Aid Simplification and Transparency Act. And then just recently, he put out an accountability white paper, which is focused on the importance of accountability of higher education institutions. If families are taking, or families and or students are taking on a lot of debt, making sure that they graduate with a degree that gets them a job and a wage that allows them to pay back that debt. And that's what that accountability is all about. It includes a focus on accreditation. I'm not going to talk about accreditation today, but also about changes that need to happen to accreditation of higher ed institutions. He also had a number of hearings on these and other topics from November through January. So he had been moving forward really quickly towards trying, and he actually had a goal of April 1st to have a bill introduced in the Senate. That didn't happen. Everything kind of got stalled over on the Senate side. You may remember ESSA. Are folks familiar with the Education Secondary Act? That got passed in a very bipartisan way by Senator Alexander and Senator Murray. But it's at implementation now at the state level, and there's a disagreement about how it should be implemented, and that disagreement is stopping them from talking about HEA. So remember I said it has some to do with politics, not just good policy. I think at the end of the day, all these folks want to do good policy, but politics sometimes gets in the way and slows things down. So there was no bill introduced in the Senate side on April 1st, and I see no potential, we'll talk a little bit more later on, as to whether or not there will even be a Senate bill introduced in this Congress. So now I'm going to do a deep dive, starting with the PROSPER Act. That's the bill that's been introduced. That's the 542-page document. I'm going to hit on a couple of highlights, just things that I think you should be aware of and know about. There are analyses of that bill out there, and there are high-level overviews of it, summaries, but just a couple of things that I want to point out. One is FAFSA simplification. This is being talked about and has been talked about for quite some time about the confusion and the fear that it is stopping families from actually completing the FAFSA. Some say that it's more difficult than doing your taxes every year. So there is a real push on this side to simplify the FAFSA. The PROSPER Act includes language around creating a mobile app for the FAFSA, doing consumer testing of the FAFSA so they figure out how best to streamline that. Some of you may have heard that there was legislation passed last year around prior year, being able to use the prior year income. This codifies that and puts it into law, so that's in the PROSPER Act. There are a number of aspects around simplification that are in there that I think are all good for families and for borrowers and will make life easier, not only for them, but for you, for those of you who work with families trying to figure out how to pay for college. And at the end of the day, I think the goal is to get more folks to complete the FAFSA application. Federal financial aid eligibility notification. This is kind of cool. We saw a couple of bills introduced both in the House and the Senate last year, and they were bipartisan in nature. And so it's great to see it in the PROSPER Act. This is beginning to notify students in their sophomore year of high school what their eligibility might be in financial aid. So knowing if your parents' income is X right now and everything stays the same, you would be eligible for this amount of Pell, this amount of loans, etc. So it gives them a sense that college is affordable. Again, I think this would be a great tool for all of you to use if those families were to then get this and bring this into you and talk to you about that. It helps you figure out and counsel them on what schools they should be thinking about, what they can afford. So I really like this one, and I think this is something that will move forward. College Dashboard, this hits along some of those ideas of accountability and transparency. There's the College Navigator website out there, which they're talking about doing away when the College Dashboard gets up. This will list college tuition, financial aid, graduation rates. They are even talking about having data in there down to the program level, so program of study. So if you're an engineering major, not just for the institution as a whole, you're an engineering major, you know, what's the tuition, how much aid have folks had to take out, how much in loans have they had to take out, what has been the graduation rate or completion rate, what has been the income of a graduate, what's the income of that graduate 5 years out, 10 years out. I think this is all moving in a really great direction to give families and students great information for making really well-informed decisions about where to go to college and how to pay for college. Financial aid counseling, there have been bills introduced, and again, great to see this in the Prosper Act, looking at annual requirements of counseling borrowers, and not just borrowers, Pell Grant recipients as well, every year. Not just once at the beginning with an entrance interview and once at the end with an exit interview, but every year throughout that process. And there are actually also, there's language in here about the exit interview, making it very specific to an individual. So as a borrower, it would show your loan debt. You know, what is, your program was engineering. This is what can be expected in terms of income, graduation, what you should be able to repay, all of that information they want to get. Again, this Congress has been very focused on getting as much information into the hands of families as possible. And I should have started this all off with student debt, and the concern over student debt is probably the #1 thing I hear all the time on the Hill. They want to figure out how to fix this. And some will say it has to do with the cost of college. Some will have to say it has to do with the easy availability of loans without any connection to what jobs and what the income is on the other side. There are a number of arguments. So as I'm talking about these things, you can hear them trying to chip away at this issue by providing more information to families to make smart decisions. This also pushes to one loan, one grant. So combining SEOG and Pell Grant into one grant program, and the 6 loan programs that are out there into one loan program. And I'll talk in a minute about the loan limits they're suggesting, because it's kind of interesting what they're doing here with this program. But again, it's about simplification. This is so confusing, and I think we ended up with all these different loan programs because every time someone comes in, they want to create something new or some new opportunity, and it just adds up and adds up. And so they're bringing it all back and making it easy for families to understand. Similarly on the back end with repayment. There are, I don't know, I've lost count. I think there are 13 different repayment options on the back end of a federal loan program. There's income-based, income-driven, there's repay, there's pay, there's graduated, there's standard. I mean, it's not surprising people are having difficulty repaying their student loan. It's hard to figure out. There is public service loan forgiveness, there's regular loan forgiveness, there's teacher loan forgiveness. I mean, there's so many options. It's incredibly confusing. And so they're talking about streamlining that all down and making that easy for people to figure out how to manage the back end. So again, this bill is 542 pages. I have maybe touched on 50 pages here. There's so much more in there, but I just wanted to give you a sense of what I thought would be some things you'd be interested in. And let me just do a little bit of a deep dive down into the loan programs. These are the changes that they're proposing to what we know today as the Stafford Loan Program, and it would be a combination of the Stafford sub and unsub. So there is no unsub and sub anymore in their world. There is one undergraduate loan program. So the current loan limits are there, and so you'll see they go up about $2,000 per year at each level of school. This is for independent, which is a little bit higher, but still going up about $2,000. What's interesting is what they've done with the parent loan program. So today it's cost of attendance less other aid, and there's really no cap on it. Under the Prosper Act, they're capping it at $12,500 minus whatever your student gets in that undergraduate loan. Yes?
Is this the PLUS loan program?
This is what was known as the PLUS loan program, yes. So they call it the one loan under the Prosper Act, but yes, it's the parent loan.
Okay.
So if it's $12,500 and you get $6,000 or your child gets $6,000 in an undergraduate loan under this one loan program, the parent can only borrow $6,500. And I asked them why they designed it this way, and this is a really interesting answer. It came from the staff on the House Ed and Workforce side. Something we've been very concerned about is that the fact that there is no limit currently on the PLUS loan program, and a family that has no negative credit, but also doesn't have really great income, can go and borrow $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 a year, and has no ability to repay that. You're setting them up for disaster, right? So their way of controlling that, and the problem was, we had said, well, why don't you put credit criteria in there and restrict people's ability to borrow? They tried to do that under the Obama administration, and the HBCUs and HSIs came forward and said, no, you can't do that. There are a whole lot of families who won't be able to go to college. So they backed off. So they didn't want to have that fight again. So their solution was to do this, because they assumed that most families, so this is their way of limiting borrowing. A parent now can't overborrow $40,000 or $50,000 anymore, because if they come from a low-income background, they should be Pell eligible. They should be getting their max in terms of their undergraduate loan, and so that really limits the amount the parent can borrow. The other thing they did is by increasing the loan limits for the undergrad by $2,000, if there is debt for this population, it's going to the person who's getting the degree, who should have the income to be able to pay it back, not the parent, who probably isn't going to have an increase in their income. So that was their way of addressing it. It's really interesting how they chose or tried to figure out how to deal with some of these issues. All right, I'm going to move on now to the Senate side. So the Senate Republicans, as I mentioned, Senator Alexander, FAFSA simplification. How many people remember this talk about FAFSA is going to be a postcard? Yeah, that was Senator Alexander. Now, postcard doesn't work, I think with 3 questions on it, right? But it doesn't work because then institutions who have their own aid still need a lot of data. So families were going to end up having to fill out a form, whether it was FAFSA or something else. So they are looking at ways to simplify this. I think he's gotten off the idea of a postcard, but the idea, I think he was making a point. There's way too much being gathered. There are other ways to get at this. And looking at the IRS data retrieval tool and finding ways to streamline that and expand that and have that work better. He also has a big push towards notification. In the Prosper Act, it says start giving families information about their Pell eligibility and financial aid eligibility as sophomore year. This is junior and senior, so he's a little bit later. That's something I think they can come together on, but same concept, same idea. Instead of 1 grant, 1 loan, he's 1 grant, 3 loans. So he's still keeping undergraduate student loan, graduate loan, and parent loan. So he's taking a little bit of a different approach, but it's still, I think, similar in terms of idea. Simplifying it. Pell Grant flexibility, and I should have mentioned this is also in the Prosper Act. Looking at greater flexibility around the Pell Grant, also looking at ways to expand the reach of and the dollar amount available. Well, that's actually on the Democrat side. Republicans not as much, but still wanting to put more flexibility out there, year-round Pell, different ways for folks to use Pell. There have been some policies and some discussions around front-ending Pell, so that those folks that try college but don't succeed don't end up with loan debt. They have some Pell grant money, so that you only then take out loans in your junior and senior year. And we know that most people who make it to the junior year of college are more likely to persist and graduate than those in the freshman year. So I think that's an interesting idea that will be talked about as well. Limiting borrowing, and they are looking on the Senate side at program level. So if you're an engineering student, the amount you can borrow might be greater than if you are a, who do I pick on? Philosophy major. Sorry to all you philosophy majors in the room. Or maybe education, which we know doesn't pay well. So they're looking at making the loan limits potentially tied to your program of study, which is really interesting. And getting at this idea of finding a way to help families or students in particular not take on more debt than they can afford to repay with whatever job they end up with on the other side. They are also interested in streamlining repayment plans on the back end. They want two. They want a standard 10-year and one income-driven repayment plan, so just two options. And then higher education accountability. I think this goes to that point of looking at and providing data around what it costs to go to college, how many people are graduating, with how much debt, and this goes to the accreditation conversation. You know, if only 30% of your students are actually completing and graduating, and everybody's leaving with debt, there's a perceived issue and problem there, and that needs to be looked at. So they want to beef up accreditation around institutions and make them more accountable, if you will, to making sure that students who go to school and take out debt, well, whether they take out debt or not, or paying for an education, they get the value of that education on the back end that was put forward in the school's mission and positioning in terms of what they're going to deliver and what value they're going to provide. So we see this, again, on both sides. On the Democrats, some of this will look familiar to you as well. First one is affordability and student debt. For them, this is about free college or debt-free college. I'll say debt-free college first. And they're looking at whether or not state university should be free, community colleges should be free, or maybe the first 2 years of any institution should be free, and I mean debt-free. So it may be Pell Grants. They're also looking at increasing back the state-federal partnership of funding, because we've seen a real decline over the last years in the amount that states are putting forward in terms of grant funding for institutions and for paying for college. So they want to see that balance move back up again. And of course, you know, Bernie Sanders is sort of leading the charge on debt-free college, but really focused on this issue of student debt and making sure that folks are not graduating and not being able to pay back their student loans. Accountability and transparency are also big on their side, on the Democratic side as well. They are pushing probably harder than we saw in the Prosper Act or in the Republican framework around what they're looking for in terms of accountability and transparency. They want all kinds of information available on a number of different levels for parents, for students, and they're also pushing hard on the accreditation side as well. Access and success, this has a lot to do with Pell Grant flexibility and increasing the number of dollars, actually the dollars, as well as the number of folks that are able to get. And this may be, Charles, where this, you've heard some talk about this, expanding what the income eligibility might be. So there's a lot of conversation in there around making sure that in particularly those folks that are from disadvantaged backgrounds have access to higher education, increasing the number of folks that are able to go to college from those backgrounds. That's a huge focus of the Democratic framework. And then, as I mentioned, Senator Murray, her big issue is campus safety. And so this is around sexual assault. It is around people of color. It is around LGBT. It is all of those issues. It is disabled students. It is veterans. It is all about making sure that they have rights, that they feel safe, that they are at an institution and feel comfortable and are able to pursue their education without any fear of anything happening to them. And for her, that's a big piece of what she wants to see come forward in an HEA bill. So quickly, let me just sort of summarize what I think are areas of agreement, and I think you may have heard these themes as well. FAFSA simplification, everybody agrees, something's got to happen there. Addressing the complexity of student loan repayment. I think there's consistency across both sides on this. Increasing accountability, that's sort of number one we heard. Expanding Pell Grants, the Democrats and Republicans may talk differently about how they want to do that, but generally speaking, they do want to do that. And early information, whether it's your sophomore year or your junior or senior year, getting information about your eligibility for federal financial aid, whether that's grants or loans, getting that information into families early, that's consistent across both sides. So there's a lot of areas of agreement, but there's still a lot of areas of disagreement. The Senate HEA reauthorization bill, as I mentioned, was supposed to be introduced on April 1st. It hasn't happened. So it is not likely that we will see a Senate bill this year. I was on the Hill speaking to both the Senate minority and majority staff just 2 weeks ago. On the minority staff, so this is Ranking Member Murray's office, they want to push for one comprehensive bill that covers all of these issues, and they won't settle for anything less. On the Republican side, Senator Alexander would like to see something happen this year. So he's pushing for these areas of agreement. Why don't we get a bill or two out on all the things that we agree on, and then we'll tackle the hard stuff next year. Senator Murray, if we do that, there's no impetus to deal with the hard stuff. Like, we can fight about this because the stuff that's the easy stuff, that's the stuff everybody's talking about. That's the front page of the newspapers. You know, student debt, accountability, you know, access to education, complexity of loan programs. Those things are all up there. So I think that there's this pushback. So that's why I don't think we're going to see anything this year. When will reauthorization happen? Maybe 19, maybe 20. I do not think it's going to happen this year. I think that ship has sailed, especially as everybody starts to disappear this summer to go out and campaign for the midterm elections. That being said, it's still important, to the extent that you're interested in sort of weighing in, taking a look at the Prosper Act and what you agree with or what you disagree with, and reaching out to your congressional member and weighing in, because they do take that all into consideration. It will get reauthorized. There are important issues that need to be done here. The other interesting thing, and I was talking to someone on the Hill, is that as we move forward towards the election, there is going to be a desire for some feel-good bills. So if there is an issue out there that it's in the press a lot, there's an easy fix to it, it's bipartisan in nature, that might be passed through. So how many people have been paying attention to the Teach Grant issue? Right? So that's an issue where there is this grant program for teachers who go and work in underserved areas. If when you finish school and you decide to go get a job, you don't work in an underserved area, that grant turns into a loan. And just like a Stafford loan. And the interest rate applies and all of that. Well, what we've been reading in the newspapers, for those of you who haven't, is that if somebody misses that deadline by 1 day, and they've fulfilled all the obligations, but they've missed that deadline by 1 day, they're not eligible, even though they're working in an underserved area, et cetera. Every other program we have has a grace period and ability to go back, but Teach Grant doesn't. So one of the things we're working on is to bring together a number of associations in DC to try and pull together a bill that will actually move forward as a feel-good bill that might actually get passed to provide some relief to these families, so we don't have to wait for HEA reauthorization. That's an example of some of the things that we try to do in the interim, especially given that this is an election year. They're going to want something they can go back to their constituents and say, look what I did, look what I voted for. You know, HEA is not moving forward, but I'm working towards helping, you know, families. I think I've used up all my time. So thank you very much for your attention and your great questions. I really appreciate it.